I've never talked about this subject publicly, but I feel that it's time because I've had so many people write to me and I really want to share more insights on this topic of spiritual abuse and also to help you to see its correlation with narcissistic abuse. There is a big difference between religion and spirituality and calling yourself a Christian and actually embodying Christ consciousness. I spent 2 decades being heavily indoctrinated in a pseudo-religion. Well, it actually fits the definition of a cult more. And I'm not going to share specific details because I don't want to make this personal. I do not want people to get defensive about what's right and what's wrong. This is simply my experience and I'm sharing it because it's something that I went through. And I just want to clarify that I'm not angry at the people. I'm not angry at what I went through. Simply because I see that most of the people that are involved in these sort of things are generally really loving and kind individuals who simply do not know that they have been indoctrinated by a fear-based program. It really is disguised as something that's good. And we have these filters that disable us to see anything else outside the reality that we've been trained to see. And I'll talk more about the specifics of this in a future video. I was taught to regurgitate scriptures at every opportunity. I was taught to judge others and to simply see them as potentially being able to be recruited and to ignore those people who definitely weren't able to be recruited simply because they didn't share my beliefs. Because I, of course, thought that this was the one true religion and the only one way to God. The hypocrisy was unbearable and eventually it became extremely difficult to deny. My mind was filled with a bunch of delusions, concepts based on questionable interpretations of the Bible, and a lot of magical thinking, mainly revolving around high emotionality, and definitely a lot of fear and guilt. But what I noticed that was missing was the ability to be reasonable, to be objective, to be observant, or to be discerning. And definitely curiosity and introspection was seen as a threat. There was a general fear of education, and that's why any further education that was worldly, like a university degree or anything beyond high school, was actually discouraged. So there was a lot of control of information. And I now know that withholding information is a form of tyranny. In the first 20 years of my life, despite all the dedication to the religion that I inherited, my existence, and I can't really say life because I didn't have a life, everything was controlled from what I wore, where I went, how I spent my free time, what books I read, what I could and could not watch. Literally everything was controlled, including to the thoughts I was allowed or not allowed to have. Everything was only ever good or bad. It was basically us against them. So there was a lot of black and white thinking. There was no grey. It either met God's approval or it met God's disapproval. It was filled with a lot of exclusionary tactics. I had no psychological freedom. I felt so oppressed and isolated. I existed in a constant state of fear, mainly that I was not good enough, and in daily terror that the end of the world was coming. I had this tremendous guilt that I was defective and that I was flawed no matter what I did. And there was that crippling sense of toxic shame that God was somehow always disappointed with me. And I definitely have a lot of childhood memories of being told that if I didn't obey, I was going to be destroyed by God. So you can see how terrorizing that would be to a young child who has no ability to discern whether this is real, whether this is not real. And of course, growing up, I could never voice my feelings or my thoughts. Everything revolved around conforming and people-pleasing, being a subservient sheep, and I was constantly told what to think, but never how to think. So you can see this crazy-making religious environment is a recipe for mental illness, which eventually I got confirmation of. Anxiety, depression, and I ended up in therapy for CPTSD, chronic grief. And these were all associated with narcissistic abuse, but also spiritual abuse. And when I eventually left, the endless thoughts of suicide, the relentless feeling of meaninglessness were a direct result of the ostracizing and the shaming. Of course, I didn't recognize that at the time, because the religious indoctrination ensured that the guilt would erode my will to live, and therefore I'd be more likely to return to the flock. It's a really predictable recipe for controlling people. And then, of course, I didn't know anything about the outside world, and there was a tremendous fear of how on earth was I going to belong. And I was so unprepared for the world because I had been focusing all my life on preparing for the end of the world. And deep down, I felt imprisoned by these mind control programs that filtered my every choice. It was really difficult to discern anything because I had never known a life outside of that environment. It's exactly like being in a narcissistic relationship because you feel that something is wrong, but you never know what it is. It's a very ambient form of abuse, but yet it's very subtle in the way it suffocates you. I was discouraged to think beyond the limits of what I was programmed to believe. I was mistrustful of God, and then I felt guilty about being mistrustful of God. Psychologically, I was exhausted, and I'm sorry to say, but despite all the rituals, all the reciting of the scriptures, attending church 3 to 4 times a week, personal study, group study, none of that gave me any sort of sense of spirituality. And just like being in a relationship with a narcissist, we are in this illusion of this happy relationship, of this perfect family, of this amazing religion, but yet we feel empty and dead inside. And of course, I didn't recognize any of this as being spiritually abusive, or the great cost that it had on my psychological well-being. It disabled me from living my life authentically. In fact, I was just meant to be a drone, a compliant, subservient sheep. I was meant to blindly obey and to become a replica of the only version that apparently God would approve of. And this manifested as an ongoing grieving process and subclinical depression. It resulted in me hating God. In fact, I couldn't even say that word for a good decade. So choosing the direction of my heart over the religion that I was indoctrinated in as a child literally cost me my life as I knew it. I was shunned and I was ostracized and abandoned, not to mention repeatedly threatened and my family's support withdrawn. Well, let me actually clarify that. My family's support came with conditions, such as returning to the flock, remaining submissive, unquestioning, compliant, and voiceless. And if you've seen any of my videos and you're getting to know me here on YouTube, you can realize that that just wasn't going to go down well at all. But despite everything that I've been through and that I've survived, I have learned to transmute all of that into something positive. And I recognize the value of that, because now I have an extremely strong voice, and yes, I do have very strong opinions as a result of the experiences that I have been through. I literally feel like I've lived several lifetimes, even though I may appear chronologically a certain age. Just in this lifetime alone, the things that I have survived and I have been through have really been an opportunity for me to clarify my voice, to get really discerning with my boundaries. And yeah, it feels like my whole life has been a battle for me to live my life authentically. And if you can relate to anything that I'm saying, you may also be getting that feeling that we are living in a point in history where it is a battle for human consciousness. So if anyone is repressing you, if anyone is holding you back from expansion, from learning, whether it's a religion, a spiritual belief, a personal relationship that's trying to squeeze you into a box to conform, it is actually a hindrance to your evolution. So by what I've described, you can see that there is a lot of correlation between narcissistic abuse and cult indoctrination. And you know, it's not surprising to see these patterns, these narcissistic programs, because the spirit of narcissism, or the narcissistic entity, has infiltrated everything in our society, from religion to spirituality to the media to medicine, the government. There is so much gaslighting going on, confusion and manipulation of humanity. So it's not surprising that if you don't obey and if you don't become subservient, if you're reluctant to being just a cog in the wheel, you will come across a lot of challenges. But these are opportunities for you to demonstrate strength and authenticity. So reconnecting to your heart is the way out of any indoctrination. And us evolving to higher levels of consciousness means that we have to continuously and repeatedly reassess what we believe. And what I want to leave you with is that you will always know truth by the way it feels. Words can be misinterpreted, but what resonates uniquely for you as truth at this time cannot be manipulated. Organized religion has provided humanity many intermediaries, and unfortunately, history tells us that humanity has been in a deep state of unconsciousness. And so many of us have been traumatized, so we have lived in a constant state of fear. And when we are in fear, we are more easily indoctrinated. We're more prone to spiritual abuse and also narcissistic abuse because we are vulnerable. So reconnecting to your heart, developing a strong and healthy sense of self-worth, and always checking in with yourself is our number one priority. It appears that humanity is now ready to reclaim a more personal connection to God source. A lot of spirituality and religious beliefs, just like narcissistic abuse, have been cloaked and made to appear like it's something good and well-meaning. But the undercurrent is all manipulation and crowd control. But we are now waking up to all the different ways in which we have been enslaved, all the different ways that we have willingly and unknowingly surrendered our will. We are starting to recognize all the different middlemen who have deceived us into believing that we are unworthy. It is such a mass lie, and it's part of the covert enslavement agenda. And this is the biggest deception that humanity has been spoon-fed. And that's why knowledge and education and rebuilding your self-worth are essential keys to breaking this program of indoctrination. Once you recognize this, it's like recognizing narcissistic abuse for the first time. You can never go back and pretend like you're asleep, because all of a sudden it's like the lights have just gone on for you. Life is meant to be good for us. And one thing that I'm absolutely certain of is that God wants us to be abundant and joyous and happy. And I'm not saying that I know it all. I'm still learning discernment. I'm still recovering my authentic self. And I'm still healing from spiritual abuse. But the thing that's really helped me clarify is a really basic exercise. I just stop and ask myself a really simple question. Am I doing this? Am I thinking this? Am I believing this out of love or fear?